All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Swedenborg and Life. Today we're going to be talking about ecology and spirituality. So just about everybody can... Oh, wait, sorry. I forgot. We have topics. We got to get to that. One is variety is perfect. Another is forest gardening. And a third, the correspondence of diatoms. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when we get there. So there's some kind of emotional connection to nature. Just to see all the forms that it produces, the variety, the spectrum, to see the vastness of it and the time scale it operates on. Being around nature lifts the spirit, captivates the spirit. Actually, a good portion of spirituality is inseparable from nature. People find meaning in it, find connection, find something higher. And today we want to look at why. Why are spirituality and nature so meshed? And what can the things we see out there in the physical world tell us about the things beyond the physical world? Stay tuned. Okay, we're back. This may be a little deja vu if you guys are long time fans of this show. It's me solo in the studio with an earbud in. That hasn't happened in probably 20 years, but it's here today. My name is Curtis. I'm with the Swedenborg Foundation, a nonprofit that tries to get Swedenborg's ideas into the conversation. Excited about today's topic, man. It's one near and dear to my heart. I do have a guest, though. It's not just me all alone. I have with me today on the show Lincoln Smith. Hey, Lincoln. Lincoln runs Forested, a forest garden company in Bowie, Maryland. He helps landowners in the eastern U.S. create forest gardens through consultation and through training at the Forested Demonstration Garden. Thanks very much for being on the show, man.
I'm glad to be here. It's Bowie.
Is it Bowie? Okay, because before the show he went over with me, like, okay, this is how you pronounce it. And I was like, great, man, don't worry, I won't shame your home, or not your hometown, but your current town. But I did it anyway. All right, so thanks very much for coming on the show. You guys can be a part of this show, even if so far it hasn't merited you wanting to do that. We have a question segment, as you know. At the second half of the show, we'll be taking your live questions and comments. Do you have thoughts on how do ecology and spirituality go together? What do they mean to you, or anything we're about to talk about here? So get those in, just enter them wherever you're hanging out. We'll grab them and put them up. All right, so we're going to start out with our first discussion topic now. All right, so part one is called Variety is Perfect, and that title comes out of a quote by Swedenborg that I want to pull up on the screen right now and take a look at. This is from Heaven and Hell. We can see from the natural world as though in a mirror how perfection stems from variety in heaven as well, since things that happen in the natural world offer us a reflection of things in the spiritual world. So Swedenborg is saying this comes up a lot in different parts of his written material, this idea that to have a complete whole, you need to have a variety of elements going into it. And the greater the variety, the more perfect the whole can be. And so it seems like he's saying that shows up in spirituality and in nature and ecology. So Lincoln, you do a lot of work, out in the field with ecological systems and all that. And how do you see variety showing up as a key component of that?
Well, I guess one of the most striking contrasts you can see that illustrates it is to walk from a cornfield into the forest next to the cornfield.
Right.
And, of course, cornfield is a vast block of just a single species growing. And then in the forest, you have just this enormous diversity and richness. And you almost feel it even before you understand it. You can just walk into a forest and feel uplifted and refreshed. But what makes that happen, I think, in large part, is the vast array of different species working together, filling different niches, performing different functions.
Yeah, and you kind of see people definitely feel something when they hit nature, and it's as close to a natural state as they can. People seem to have a greater and greater connection to it, and I think you're right that part of it is this. There's so much going on. There's complexity here at play, and it also so the more species that are in an ecosystem, the healthier that ecosystem is.
Yeah, it's a pretty core tenet of at least ecology as we currently practice it, trying to understand the natural world. Yeah.
And so how do you see, so what is Swedenborg talking about when he's saying there needs to be this variety on a spiritual level as well? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, well, I love how Swedenborg relates everything in the natural world to people's spiritual lives and people's spiritual communities of people. Uh, And I think if you look at a forest ecosystem with tall oaks and fruiting trees underneath the oaks that are smaller, and then vines growing up, and in a lot of cases working very harmoniously together, that can be an image of the way a human community can work. If we're working well together, we're each doing our job and complementing what else is going on. I love it, like in the forest, just to take an example of the forest,
Sure.
There's plants in the forest that come up in the very early spring, and they're really tiny for the most part, spring ephemerals. They're out there catching sunshine and living their lives before the oak trees overhead or whatever even puts their leaves on. So they're interesting themselves, if you could put it in human terms, interesting themselves in something that the other members of that community aren't doing. So the oak tree and the ephemerals underneath it work very well together. They're not, in fact, they each need each other in different ways, and it's very similar to the way different people have different passions and different spiritual callings to serve the greater community.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was just talking to someone recently who was thinking about what fields would you go into of work, and there are certain fields that are much less crowded because very few people want to have to do them. And so if there weren't people who with a passion for that or a willingness to do it, you'd have this unserved need in society, and the whole thing would suffer. And you kind of get a little bit of that with the way these different plants are taking advantage of the different kinds of sunlight. And so Swedenborg talks about how in the spiritual world there are these communities where everything is sewn together in that kind of harmony, but also inside a human being. That he says trees, plants, these kinds of things are images of what he would call our affections or our intentions, thoughts, that they're acting in the forest the same way our different thoughts and feelings are acting within us. And it's just interesting. Yeah. And perhaps we sense some of that we're looking at us when we go out there, and we can learn something even if we're not totally aware of it.
Yeah, definitely. And we relate to the trees and the animals that we see, and I think part of the reason there's a connection or a resemblance is that we all ultimately come from the same source. There is a creative force in the universe can look at as God, so some of that life flows into the trees, some of it flows into the butterflies and other animals, and some of it flows into us. So there's that connection naturally, and we can learn things about ourselves from being students of it.
Certainly, and that's another way that variety shows up, and that Swedenborg does talk about. Emanating from the divine is this force, but everybody receives it in a different way, receives it according to their form. And he likens it to the sun, that on the physical plane, the sun's light and heat, flow into all kinds of different plants, but they sprout up according to their form. It can be very different, even though it's all receiving the same solar energy. So that's a great point. And diversity shows up all over the place in nature, even within populations. The more genetic diversity there is, all that kind of stuff creates this more happy, healthy whole. So that leads us into our second topic. So let's take a look at that before we get rolling. So I call this one forest gardening, and Lincoln, you may recognize that picture. Oh no, you can't see it. Just so you know, on screen, a little drawing that you did of a forest garden was swirling around there for our watchers' viewing pleasure. I want to start this with a quote from Swedenborg where he is describing something that he came across in the spiritual world that very much resembles actually the work that you're doing in the physical world. So let's take a look at that quote. This is from True Christianity. He's describing a scene in heaven. The trees were laid out in a long curving row that extended and came around to form the arcing arm of a grand spiral. It was a perfect spiral of trees, in which one species followed another according to the relative excellence of its kind of fruit. The trees toward the center were the most excellent of all. They were covered in rich, sumptuous fruit. Called paradise trees, they were unlike anything that has ever been or ever could be witnessed on earth or anywhere in the physical universe. Here and there along this long, spiraling line of trees, there were living benches that had been crafted by bending and weaving together the branches of the tree just behind them. These were decorated with an abundance of the tree's fruits. Along the continuous arcing line of trees, there were openings that led into flower gardens, and these led to lawns that were divided into grassy areas and flower beds. Seeing all this, the people accompanying the angel said, "It is heaven itself laid out before us." So this is, Swedenborg is writing this, mid-1700s, long before there was any concept of forest gardening. But it seems like there he is describing what a modern forest garden is like, right?
Yeah, and I derive a lot of inspiration from that description. Although of course we can't grow paradise fruit beyond description here.
Come on, man, step it up.
But yeah, I love the diversity described in that. Like we were talking about a little while before. Just to maybe step back for a second, a forest garden is an agricultural system, but it's modeled on the forest. So what we're trying to do is feed people and restore the environment in the same piece of ground.
Which is cool because usually it's seen as either or. Like, okay, this is either got to be agriculture or nature preserve. But you're kind of fusing the two.
Yeah, and there are people who are very sincerely working on either side of that picture. Like, we got to feed people, so we have to squeeze as much yield out of this acreage as possible. And people on the other side, we have to save the forest. Fortunately, forest gardening tries to do both at the same time. I think there's tremendous potential there. It is a challenge, but we can rise to it. And yeah, one of the fundamental components of it is you include a diversity of species because that can allow ecosystem functions like cleaning the water and building soil and providing wildlife habitat to come from that piece of ground where you're harvesting your food and materials.
Yeah, so give a little bit of an example. Like what would a forest garden look like if it was on a few acres? What plants would be there? What would be going on?
Well, one of the main things is that you're mimicking the structure of the forest. So you have tall trees overhead, maybe pecan trees you can picture, or walnuts or something. Underneath those, there are fruit trees. There are vines climbing up the trees. Actually, just yesterday we were planting some of our native delicious grape species to grow up some locust trees out of the forest garden here in Bowie. And so it's got that really cool forest-like structure to it, but it is organized to be manageable and efficiently harvested as much as possible. So it's always that balance that we're trying to strike.
Yeah, and I think it's cool. It's sort of Swedenborg places a lot of emphasis on usefulness, or how if something is helping people, then it kind of has this heavenly aspect to it. And I see forest gardening as kind of we're taking an area and having it be really useful in that it's doing, as you said, both sides. We can both be feeding people and maintaining the ecosystem in this one little piece of ground. So that's like a very Swedenborgian thing to do.
Yeah, and it's totally beautiful too at the same time, and a pleasure. We've started to get our first few fruits at this forest garden here, and it really is a growing movement. You see community forest gardens are also sometimes called food forests, and they're really springing up around the United States right now, and I think it's a great movement because people are realizing, there's a lot of people on the planet now compared to when we invented agriculture, maybe 10,000 years ago. And it's time for the human race to accept responsibility for our ecological impact. And we can do that by redesigning some of our systems to restore ecological function.
Yeah, man. So I want to link this into, so Swedenborg often compares the human mind to a garden. He was a gardener himself, and he talks about how sort of that organization of plants and the trying to get usefulness out of a space is like a person whose mind has grown into this thing that bears fruits, which would be acts of good, acts of love. So we're kind of having a picture there of an angel in this garden as he would see it. So what I want to do here for everybody watching is do a little. We usually do this thing at the end of the show called Correspondences, where we take a little some kind of element of the physical world and look at it with spiritual thought in mind. So we're going to do a little segment on forest gardens right now. We pulled up a couple of pictures of forest gardens from Wikimedia Commons. And so we're going to take a look at these. And while you're seeing them, be thinking, of the spiritual kind of connotation, which is this, a human mind that can both, maintain the environment and produce acts of service. So something good, whatever it is. So take a look at this, just be like 30 seconds, and then we'll come back and move to our next segment. So just some shots of some intentional gardening, and so I take with it what you will. One of our producers pointed out to me, like we have a million producers or something, pointed out to me, if you look behind, there's our perennial. Oh, it's so hard to turn my thumb towards it. Behind me, there's our perennial guest, that plant back there. It's flowering for this episode, which I just thought was very apropos. Okay, so let's now move on to our third subject for discussion, which is diatoms. All right, so this came out of a paper I read, which was part of the inspiration for the whole episode, which was written by Dr. Sherri Cooper, and it's about the correspondence of diatoms. And you may say, what's a diatom? Well, we're going to show you that right now. And this is just an exercise in taking Swedenborg stuff that he wrote, in the 1700s and applying it to very modern science and seeing how it holds up. So let's take a look at, this is an excerpt we put together from her paper and just made a little PDF of it. It's not the entire paper and it's abridged. But first of all, what are diatoms? Let me fill you guys in case you're not there already. Diatoms are single-celled autotrophic organisms that live primarily in aquatic systems and have a silica frustal consisting of two valves that are preserved as fossils and sediments after the diatom dies. And if you don't speak much biology, that just means it's a little tiny thing that lives in the water and fossilizes as well. Diatoms are currently classified within the kingdom Chromista, subkingdom Chrysophyta, phylum Orcrista, class Berciliophyracea or Diatomea. And some people are all like hyper about, ooh, did I pronounce that right or something? I have no pride around that, man. I didn't even pronounce Bowie right in Maryland. So, okay, looking back at the PDF. So there are more known species of, so why are diatoms important? There are more known species of diatom than in any other class of organisms outside the animal kingdom. Even within the animal kingdom, only certain classes of insects may contain more species than the diatoms. Current estimates are that the diatoms consist of about 200,000 species, but there are other estimates as high as 1 million. Diatoms are also estimated to produce approximately 25 to 30% of the world's oxygen supply, which is more than all the rainforests combined. So even if you didn't know about diatoms, you're breathing them right now. They're an excellent food source at the base of the food web in almost all aquatic systems, freshwater, brackish, and marine. Their food storage is lipid, fat-based rather than starch, as in plants. They're a very diverse group in terms of tolerance for various environmental conditions, but each species has its own limits and optima. This is one of many reasons that their communities are useful for study in relation to water quality issues past and present. So you guys might be thinking, why are we reading so much biology stuff? This is supposed to be a show about spirituality. It's important to know what, in order to look at this from an angle of correspondences in the way Swedenborg describes, we're trying to guess what diatoms might correspond to because Swedenborg didn't write about them. They weren't classified as such in his day. We have to know their functions to be able to guess at the correspondence. So this is going to hopefully give all of you a better sense of what correspondence means. So let's take a look at the next part of the paper here. Scrolling down. Perhaps, as others did at that time, Swedenborg may have categorized microorganisms as either small plant animals or plants. This may be an important distinction since Swedenborg's two groupings of organism into animal and plant kingdoms have particular correspondence to spiritual realities. Diatoms are most likely vegetable according to Swedenborg's categories, primarily because they are autotrophic, produce their own food from the sun's energy. Light and light energy correspond to truth. Since Swedenborg writes that the vegetable kingdom corresponds to intelligence and wisdom, the different species of diatom perhaps correspond to various small, simple, or very basic truths or knowledges of the spiritual world. So backing up for a second, Swedenborg, as I was talking about in the previous section, plants are an image of the mind, the image of the human mind, or of the spiritual qualities that can make a person's personality. So if we're thinking there are these little things, they're not technically plants now, but they feed on sunlight, they would fall into that category, and they're everywhere, and they're the basis for oxygen on the earth. They allow things to survive. So this is looking at, okay, if they do all that, there's a potential that they're kind of the base knowledges, the things that kind of make up your spiritual mind. So looking at it further, diatoms are quite beautiful in outward form. The silical glass frustal of each species of diatom has its own unique ornamentation, consisting of pores, striations, processes, and furrows. And you look at that thing, how is there not some meaning to that? And Swedenborg is saying this is saying something. That image is telling you about something in your soul, which it seems to me like it would be, because that looks cool, man. There's no getting around that. Although we might think of them as small and simple in many ways, they also contain incredible variation in the details of their individual species structure. Diatoms can also be considered the bread of the aquatic world. They are at the base of the food chain and are one of the richest or most nutritious forms of food for most organisms that eat such things. They provide food for almost all life in the food web of aquatic systems on Earth. As bread, diatoms correspond to affections for what is good and true. So Swedenborg wasn't writing about diatoms. They weren't studying those at the time, but looking, what do they do? Okay, well, they sustain the ecosystem. So in that, what is the sustenance within something spiritual? So that's how you'd start to try to plug this in. And if this isn't making any sense, that's fine. We're just sort of running through it and just poking at, okay, how would you take what he wrote back then and apply it to the current thing? So let's just wrap up that paragraph there. Affections for good. Diatoms also have the form that clothe these functions on Earth. They not only have their intricately beautiful silica shell, their color in life is called golden brown by scientists and taxonomists because of the unique chlorophyll that they contain. This is interesting. This color could arguably be called bronze, which corresponds to natural goodness. And according to Swedenborg, natural goodness represents the base, ultimates, or effects of the spiritual world and constitutes the outermost natural heaven. So you might have a convergence here. Both of these are like the base of the food chain, and they happen to represent occur in this color that Swedenborg writes represents kind of the base or natural affections. And if you go check out the show we did on the levels of heaven, you'll kind of see about this sort of base outermost level, then the inner levels, which kind of depend on that. Just like the more complex organisms higher up in the food chain depend on these diatoms. So this is just a little tidbit to say, hey man, if you look into it, there's very specific correspondence or representation of everything you find in nature with everything of the spirit. So with that in mind, let's do another brief correspondences segment. We're going to just take a few minutes 45 seconds to look at images of diatoms. And with that in mind, just be thinking and be open to what does this mean? What are these inside of me and inside the spirit? See that? I mean, that's got to be something celestial, something something deeper. You can just kind of feel it with the imagery. And so Swedenborg is saying, yes, it is a symbol of something deeper, and here's the specifics of why. So there's a quote I just want to quickly read where he sort of talks about that everything in nature has a correspondence. So let's pull that up. In a word, absolutely everything in nature, from the smallest to the greatest, is a correspondence. The reason correspondences occur is that in the natural world, including everything in it, arises and is sustained from the spiritual world, and both worlds come from the divine. So everything we see in nature is a reflection of the spiritual world somehow, and this would include things, that weren't even on the radar when Swedenborg was writing. So it's just cool to think, okay, what with modern science, things he didn't even have access to, can we sort of go even deeper into these mysteries? So those are my jumbled thoughts on it. Let's get to your clear thoughts on it. We're going to take a tiny little video break, and then I want to hear your comments and questions. So I'll see you then. All right, it's that time again. Questions, comments, we want to field them all. If you're just joining us, go ahead, type in some kind of, if you're just joining us, hopefully you can just guess what you want to talk about, and it will happen to line up with what we've already talked about. So let's see what people are thinking out on the web. Our first one is from Rita, and this is on Facebook. Does nature in the spiritual world work like earth nature? Does it start with seeds? Does it take time to grow? That's a great question, and it's one I'm going to give partial answers to, I would say, because there's a different dynamic that Swedenborg talks about. All these the processes that you mentioned, Lincoln. I'll give my thoughts first, then I'll kick it over to you and see what you want to say. The processes that you're talking about, like growth, from seed to progression, those are very important processes in the spiritual world as well. He talks about the meaning of those. However, in the spiritual world, there's not really time as we know it here. So it's not like, okay, we got to wait 4 days until this seed can grow. It's about states. It's about things being accomplished. Okay, those are my initial thoughts. Lincoln, did you have anything on that?
Well, yeah, I agree. It's a great question. It's consistent throughout Swedenborg that everything in the spiritual world is like things in the natural world, except for more so, if anything. So I got to assume that this extends to seeds, but and the way things grow and interact in the ecosystem. But I have to, but it is a tricky one too, because you'll also get the landscape at different times in Swedenborg, apparently reflecting the state of mind of the people that are in it. And so, like you said, that's a different dynamic. That was the thing because Swedenborg will also describe things appearing to view based on because we're saying correspondences and that all this stuff in nature represents what's going on inside a person, and that things will pop into view because of how a person is thinking or feeling. But I would say it's probably more complex than we understand, even from reading Swedenborg, because he talks a lot about order and how everything there follows an order, and that the system of plants and animals must be just as complex and structured, if not more so, than it is here. I think it has to do with time and space there, and then also what comes into view when, because he'll say, a bird appeared when somebody was having this kind of concept, or when a certain society of people moves into this area, the vegetation changes around. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everything poofs into existence. It could be you just become aware of it or something like that. So it's a really great question. I wish I knew the answer. That's as much as I know, but thanks very much for that. And okay. So there's our first failure to fully answer a question of the night. We'll see how many of those we can rack up. All right, so let's get to the next one. This is Mark. YouTube, why is it that plants with thorns or prickles often grow in derelict, unkept areas? Do these horrible or poisonous plants correspond to a spiritual state? Yeah, it's a great point. That they're definitely I was out walking my dog the other day, and
he poked himself on some kind of thorny plant. I don't know exactly which plant it was. There's no like leaves or anything on it anymore, but certain plants are definitely a different thing to deal with than other ones. And Swedenborg does talk about, like I was saying before, that the divine lets everything emanate. Or emanates this life force from it, but it's received in these different ways with these different forms. But even things that are harmful are still serving a use. And Swedenborg also talks, heaven and hell, this balance, even people with harmful intentions are still brought by the divine to sort of serve a use. So those are my initial thoughts. Lincoln, did you have anything to add there?
No, I think that's a good stab at it. I mean, stab at it, right?
Yeah, right.
Talking about thorns, aren't we?
Thank you.
But nettles are an interesting example in relationship to people. If you pick a nettle, you're going to really suffer for it. But it's a highly nutritious plant if you boil it in water. Correspondence-wise, I don't know what that is, but I think it is useful to expand our thoughts about what is a good or bad or useful or not useful plant.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, I've been poked by nettles before, and that ones I hadn't even done anything to, when they just poke me, But it's if we're looking at diatoms and saying, oh, there's some kind of corresponds to it have to nettles. That's a very interesting dynamic there, that you have a plant that if it touches you, it causes all kinds of harm, but if it goes through the right process, suddenly it's something that can really benefit somebody. So that makes me think of Swedenborg talks about sort of vastations or periods in the spiritual world where you have to go through a process to kind of rid yourself of harmful elements that you've picked up through life. And once you do that, you're sort of free from those, and you have a chance to let good things flow through. So I wonder if things like that are some kind of analog to that. So great question, Mark, and let's take a look at our next one. Sarah, so would you say God is trying to give us messages through nature? It's a great question. Lincoln, do you ever feel like a sort of a connection to the divine through nature and natural settings or that kind of thing?
Oh yeah, definitely. And that's such a huge topic. I don't even know where to start. But I guess even starting just purely secularly, this biophilia is a growing field of study among people. Like they'll say, well, let's take these elementary school children. If we put them in a concrete box, such as we've usually built our elementary schools like, they perform at one level. And then if we give them like views and access to nature, they perform so much better. And you can observe that just on the natural plane, but I think there's more to it than that. Like so much spirituality can be like some of the best spiritual experiences I've had have been like services that are held in the woods. Mm-hmm. It just seems to fit somehow, and I maybe can't put better words to it than that.
Well, I think that's good that you express it that way, because I think for a lot of people that's what the connection to nature is. It's like I can't quite express it, but something is going on. And we were talking about that, and that it may, if there is a divine message in it, it may be these subtle sort of almost subconscious, like look at the way things can be if everything's working interconnectedly. There's an image that's being shown there. And then of course you do have, Native American spirituality and other spiritual traditions where they would look at specific, like, oh, a crow landed here, so that means something. And I think, Swedenborg talks about the earliest people on this planet being able to read nature in a really profound, specific way, where they could, he says, before there was any kind of written revelation or anything like that nature was the revelation. So as far as how can we, how far we could tap into that if we had the knowledge, I mean, I don't know what the ceiling is there. It could be that there are very specific messages, but I don't know how to. It's not like I can say, okay, should I get a new car or not? And I'm looking to see what birds fly over. But it could be that there's something on that level, but I don't know. And I certainly feel like some people will feel like certain animals mean something to them, and I it could well be. I feel like butterflies, when one flies by, I'm like, ooh, am I learning something? I don't know. So
can I just toss one more thing in there?
No, man, I know I gotta talk forever and not let you talk. Just kidding. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, like in in my learning about nature, or the way the ecosystem works, it was throughout most of my schooling emphasized the competitive aspect. Two trees will be racing for the sun, and only one's really going to make it, and it's going to shade the other one.
Yes,
The
right.
other one's going to die. Or everything to live its life only relies, ultimately relies on destroying something else that it has to eat, and
Right.
and that is a big part of how things are set up. But above and beyond that, uh, mutualism or complementary functions or symbiosis is at least as fundamental a component of the way the ecosystem functions. And I think we can learn a lot from that. That an oak tree in the forest, and this is right there in mainstream plant science textbooks these days, although it's been discovered more recently, an
Mm-hmm.
oak tree in the forest will be competing with the other plants that are around it, but it's also feeding them, believe it or not. That plant is producing so much photosynthate from having its leaves up there in the sunshine that gets into the networks in the forest floor, and then the little seedlings that are in the deep shade there can actually tap into that wealth of photosynthate and minerals and other things that plants need that is running through the forest soil because it's just being produced in abundance. So the plants in the forest are complementing each other and actually feeding each other. And there's numerous other examples. And I feel like I've learned a lot spiritually from that. I often find myself thinking in terms of mutualistic ecological interactions when I think about, okay, so here's a person that I'm struggling to deal with, but what are both of our functions and how can we work together?
Yeah, oh, that's a great example, man. There is sort of that duality of like, because I know if I'm having problems with a person, I can either say, all right, well, how am I going to get rid of this person, or I can say, how am I going to find common ground? And that there is sort of this, if nature is this image, the theater that represents something deeper. We're being shown both sides, just like both sides kind of exist. So that's a great point, Lincoln. I'm glad that you brought it up. Let's take a look and see if we have another question here. This is from Fuzzman. And he said, what's the difference between dimensions, densities, and planes of existence? People say there's only 3 planes. Others say there's 7 dimensions and 13 densities. It's all so confusing. So with our track record, let us make this more confusing for you. So the way I see it, man, the closer you look at reality, the more complex it is. That it seems like the more people are studying it and looking into it, the more even in secular science, they're just discovering, we think there's these little strings and there's like 12 dimensions or 8 dimensions or whatever that they move in, and all this. I thought there was 3 dimensions. So there's all this stuff going on, and then Swedenborg describes some general divisions. He talks about physical and spiritual as a duality. He says within the spiritual world, there are. He talks about the world of spirits, which is like a halfway point. Then heaven and hell, as he calls them, are just like higher and lower. But then within each of those, heaven has different levels in it, and hell has different levels in it. So there could be seen as 7 divisions, but even within that, there are all kinds of different. So it seems like there's a lot, but sort of, but you could look at it simply. You could say, okay, there's a physical and the spiritual, and that the divisions sort of within the spiritual aren't of the same category as that. Lincoln, do you have any thoughts on dimensions or anything similar or anything in Swedenborg that kind of is around that topic?
Yeah, well, not specifically, but I think an approach that I like and try to use is a combination of curiosity and humbleness on the other side, because I think when humans try to figure out how, what's going on, we very quickly come to the conclusion that we understand it all. Like, I understand how this forest system works, and I can, plant a forest garden, just to take my own personal example. I can plant a forest garden that does every last thing that the natural ecosystem is doing. And I think that our track record as humans begs to differ with that. Like, we have created so many unintended consequences by thinking that we know all the answers. So I don't know how many dimensions there are, and I'm sure there are very smart people working on that. And I think it is our job to try to understand as much as we can. and do as much as we can with that in a humble way, but also to recognize, in a generation from now, they're probably going to have different answers. And the same applies spiritually. I'm gonna try my best to do a good job of helping other people, but recognizing that I may have to reevaluate. I don't have the answers. The answers come from outside of myself, from God, and I have to be ready to adjust. So anyway, sort of changed the topic there from.
No, you did the right thing, man. That's good. And I think, attitude is really all we can have. I mean, as you say, we're looking into it. Very smart people are looking into it, trying to figure it out. In 20, 30 years, they're going to look very dumb by comparison, But Swedenborg does talk about how really it's not knowledge that matters as much as like love first, wisdom second. That if we come at it with that humility that you're talking about, with the right attitude, then what we know now can be useful, and what we learn later can be useful. So, I'd love to clear up, exactly how many dimensions there are and everything. And Swedenborg does give some technical description, which I've given to you now. These sort of 7 layers of heaven and hell, and then the duality here. But it's really about using what we do have with the right spirit. So, Lincoln, I think your comments are right on. All right, so we're going to take a look at another one here. This is from Mark on YouTube, and he says, are there farmers and gardeners in the spiritual world tending to plants and crops? It's a great question. Swedenborg says everything that's here is there. That there's something that we actually get the things we have here from there. I don't think I've ever come across a specific description of a farmer, but he does mention fields with crops in them. And as we were describing earlier in the show, this sort of forest garden that he describes. So I would imagine if it's not like somebody doing the exact same thing with a plow and a hoe and that kind of thing, it's somebody performing that function, because he says whatever, like correspondence, like we're looking at diatoms, what do diatoms do for the ecosystem here? So what spiritual things do that for the internal world? So what are farmers doing here? They're creating a system which can feed people. So what does that look like on a spiritual level? So those are my thoughts. Lincoln, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I remember it's not farmers, but I remember a description I liked in Swedenborg of some metal workers who were making a lampstand, and they were they were working on this piece of hardware because it was going to be used in worship or something. But the important point why this was observed was like they were blessed to be able to work on that thing and try and help in that way. But along the way, they kind of got these are angels, I believe, or good spirits. But they along the way got sort of carried away with their own cleverness, like I created this thing. And at the end, they were brought back to the realization and the knowledge that it all comes from the Lord. So I think we will be. I think people are blessed in heaven to be able to do uses and try and keep it in perspective that it all does come from the Lord, and indeed here in the world too. Like I've just been amazed with forest gardening how the forests just happen. If you leave a piece of ground alone, it will turn into a wonderful forest. So I'm blessed to be a participant in that, but I'm not really making it,
Yeah, and just kind of to have a perception of what's our actual role in it. That it's this interesting balance in Sweden that Swedenborg describes of, participating while at the same time acknowledging the source. That it's not like God does everything without you, but everything is coming from God. It's this strange sort of balance that he mentions. And I know the thing you're talking about, and it's in sort of the heaven that he describes. Part of it is this acknowledgement of the emanation of God, and that God is behind things. And when you have that, you have this sort of blessedness, and those people kind of relearning that through their project. So that's all very interesting stuff. And we're gonna take, we're running a little long, so we're just gonna take one more, and then if we didn't get to yours, we'll try to get to it during the week if you re-put it up. So let's take a look at our last one here. This is, we're pausing trying to get it up. This is going to be our final one from YouTube. Andrew H303. Hello. Did Swedenborg ever talk about how he managed to visit the afterlife while still alive? Was there a process he used? Meditation? Was it spontaneous? It's a great question. It's one I've had before in various forms, and I can totally see why people would want to know that. I have some some sort of fragmented things. I mean, there was an element of spontaneity to it, that if you look at the process in his life that led to it, it was, he was sort of having a series of more and more vivid dreams that he describes in this dream journal he had, and then these experiences just sort of came on him. It wasn't like it was while he was living his life. It wasn't like he's like, all right, I got to give up everything, go to India, and I'm going to find this stuff, and it's going to happen. However, he definitely talks a lot about meditating, and he certainly had some kind of, he doesn't describe his practice a lot in detail, but he certainly would meditate on particular concepts, and then these sort of lucid experiences would occur. He does talk a bit about breath control, and that plays a part. But he never like sits down and lays out, okay, you light 3 candles and you sit like this and you chant this. So I think it was maybe initially had a lot of spontaneity to it, but afterwards he kind of, once he was in the groove, he sort of had a routine that he did around it. So that's my reading of it. Lincoln, do you have anything to add to that?
It's good as far as I'm concerned.
All right, good. Well, I got one right then, out of 8 or whatever. Okay, all of you, thanks so much. Those were really good, thoughtful questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Yeah, like I said, the Wirecast YouTube combination deletes these live comments after we're done, so you'd have to re-enter them if you want them answered, or if you're coming here throughout the week, just type them in. We'll try to get to them in a future show, or we'll write you back. So we're going to wrap up the show now. I don't think we need to go to a video break. That's fine. So I want to say, if you guys want to support the show, help it get it out there, you can make a donation to the Swedenborg Foundation. It's a nonprofit. Just open up the description link here, and there should be a little link there that will take you to make a little PayPal donation. Lincoln, thank you so much for being on the show. It was great to have you here, man. We hope to have you back again sometime.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for everybody for sending interesting discussion questions.
Yeah, totally. And you can get to Lincoln's website at forested.us. And if you're ever in Maryland, look him up. He can show you some cool things. Everybody will be back here next week, same time. So I'll see you then.